Hello. Well, first of all, before we get to, we have 3 topics on the show today. Before we get to those, I have a news bulletin, which is that Congressman Jim Himes, who represents, of course, Fairfield County, and it's, well, basically Fairfield County, is calling for an impeachment inquiry, which is, it's kind of a big thing. I mean, this is Jim Himes. This is not Jim Ocasio-Himes. This is Jim Himes, pretty moderate Democrat. So it means something. I don't really know what. So that's why it's not one of the big 3 topics. A little bit later on the show, we're going to talk about the Curtis Flowers case. We've talked about that two times, I think, already on the show. And there was a Supreme Court decision that, spoiler, it certainly went Flowers' way. That may not be enough to set him free, but we'll tell you all about that in the second segment with one of the producers from In the Dark, the terrific podcast, which has focused on this. And then in the final segment, as far as I'm concerned, let's call them what they are. They are concentration camps. I mean, I think they pretty well fit the definition. We are imprisoning people along the border in inhumane conditions and in a way that is intended to kind of keep them out of sight. So we'll talk about that also. But we're going to begin, as some of you have divined, I'm really kind of intrigued by Andrew Yang. I don't really know where I come down on him. I'm not #Yang Gang. You know what I am? I'm Yang curious. So Andrew Yang, for those of you not forgivably not able to follow all this, is one of the now 24. Is Sestak number 24? I think so. 24 candidates. Significant candidates for the presidential nomination on the Democratic side. One of the reasons that Yang is significant. He's a businessman with no governance experience, and a guy who's also worked in the nonprofit sector. What makes him significant is that his support came early and strong from non-traditional sources, such that he's numerically eligible to participate, for example, in this week's debate. So he will be on the Thursday night debate, the second of 2, part 2 of the Democratic field. And so we want to talk a little bit more about this. He really has a lot of ideas. He has 109 policy proposals on his website. And that's a lot. And he is speaking to a bunch of people who I think it's fair to say do not typically feel spoken to by the political process. And they fall all over the political spectrum and the ideological spectrum and the demographic spectrum, although I think it's also fair to say that most of Yang's fans and supporters are pretty young. Joining us to say all of this and much more on a far better informed basis than I just did is Will Sommer, a tech reporter for the Daily Beast. And right away, there's sort of a giveaway that I'm interviewing a tech reporter about a political candidate. I mean, there's some truth embedded in that, right? That Andrew Yang is really maybe the first digital candidate in a genuine sense.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew Yang is really sort of an internet phenomena. This is a guy who basically came out of nowhere, had very little name recognition, and this week he's going to be on the Democratic debate stage, thanks in large part to all of his internet fans who donated and put him over the threshold.
So how did he do that? I mean, look, a lot of people could think about getting on the internet and trying to make a name for themselves. What kind of game theory did he bring to this that was different?
So it's a couple things. He has a very sort of eye-catching proposal, which is his universal basic income, in which everyone in the country would get $1,000 a month. So, I mean, that's kind of the first thing he does. And then, he went on a lot of podcasts, a lot of radio shows that are popular with young people, whether that's The Breakfast Club in New York, which is kind of a hip-hop show, or the Joe Rogan podcast, which is a hugely popular podcast with young men particularly.
Right. So let's combine the two things that you just said. Here's Andrew Yang on the Joe Rogan show talking about universal basic income.
Yeah, so I've been driven to universal basic income in part because I've been looking at the numbers. The 5 most common jobs in the United States right now are administrative and clerical work, retail and sales, food service and food prep, truck driving and transportation and manufacturing. Those 5 jobs comprise about half of all American jobs. Only 32% of Americans graduate from college. So the average American is a high school grad doing one of these 5 jobs. And if you look at it, technology is already doing a number on each of these jobs. Like the first, administrative and clerical, includes call center workers. And AI is in the process of taking over that job. Retail and sales, 30% of malls are closing in the next 4 years. So the danger here is to think of it as artificial intelligence is coming. It's actually already eating up the most common jobs in our economy, and it's driving Americans into distress in various ways in the numbers.
You know, Will, it seems to me that if there's one of the many things that distinguishes Yang, and I think in a kind of a positive sense, and it's something that I've heard young people respond to, is that for the most part, candidates talk about what's going on right now and a little bit about what happened in the past, and they may cock a little bit of an eye towards the future, but not much. Yang really is talking a lot about the future. He's got some ideas about how to solve the problems right in front of us, but he's also, particularly as he starts talking about artificial intelligence, automation, robot overlords, he's also talking about the future in a way that you don't hear candidates do that much.
Right, exactly. I mean, he's talking about, 20 years from now, when we're looking at, say, self-driving trucks, putting all the truck drivers in the country out of business, and then all the people who depend on those jobs. So, I mean, he's saying, how are we going to grapple with these problems that are decades in the future?
Right. And I think, for a generation of millennials, and maybe people a little bit older than millennials, they feel as though they're living in a dysfunctional and maybe dystopian world that was created by people who never looked 20 years into the future, that baby boomers like me and people roughly around our age group, that was our big problem. We didn't look 20 years down the road. You could see why Yang would resonate.
Yeah, I mean, I think he appeals in part to young people because, as you say, this is someone who, unlike a lot of candidates, is looking more to the future. I mean, obviously, the biggest example of baby boomers ignoring the future or that they won't be around for is global warming. But, Andrew Yang is looking at both that and other things in a way that I think speaks to young people who are concerned about these issues.
And the other thing he is well, actually, let me just say a little bit more about that and get you to react to it. So I was looking at the video version of his appearance on The Breakfast Club. Breakfast Club is a hip-hop show where, for example, Lizzo would probably be a slightly more typical Breakfast Club guest. And you know what? Then I started reading the comments. And obviously, comments are not a reliable metric. But a number of people in the comments were saying, I don't vote, but I'm going to vote for this guy. I've never voted before, but I'm going to vote for this guy. And then other people explaining very carefully to them, all right, well, you have to vote in the primary, which might mean you might have to register with a party, and explaining all this to them. And I mean, obviously, people who historically don't vote, they're not a huge wave, but if you can mobilize a whole bunch of these people, particularly in a crowded field like this, once again, game theory favors you a little bit.
Right, that's exactly right. I mean, and the idea, a lot of candidates talk about, what they want to offer people. But Andrew Yang is saying very specifically, vote for me, and if I win, you'll get $12,000 a year. So, that appeals to a lot of people. And I should say it's not just young people. I mean, I think a majority of the Yang base is kind of very online young people. But, I talked to a middle-aged woman who's living in Paraguay now, an American citizen who essentially had to leave the country because she couldn't afford to live here. So, she's a dedicated Yang supporter because she thinks if this universal basic income happens, she'd be able to afford to come back to the United States.
Right. And I was also impressed on The Breakfast Club by his ability to explain things in very clear language, too. Maybe because he's not part of a public policy machine. Maybe because he hasn't run in a lot of elections and learned to kind of focus group his comments and weave in a lot of ambiguities the way politicians like to do. I think people respect the fact that they can usually understand what he's talking about.
Right, exactly. I mean, he doesn't come off like a regular politician. I think it's been interesting to see his comparative success, at least in getting on the debate stage, compared to people like, some governors, what have you, who are running in 2020, who were not able to get that same kind of support. So, I think he appeals to people. He's got a lot of kind of, I don't know if I'd call them outlandish ideas, but he's an ideas guy, and he's throwing a lot of ideas out there. And so I think people, appreciate that.
I will say that although I've been very intrigued by Andrew Yang, and I sort of have this little sort of, Billboard Hot 3 that I juggle around, but it's mostly Warren, Harris. And then I'm putting Yang in there as just kind of a wild card. But as you say, the outlandish ideas can be a bit of a problem. And having done a show about the anti-circumcision movement and having met in the course of doing and in the aftermath of doing the anti-circumcision show that we did, having met some of the worst people I've ever met in my life, like really dreadful, horrible people that you never want to encounter on the internet or anywhere else again for the rest of your life, it didn't make me happy. Like, why is that even an issue? Why is that a presidential issue? It just didn't seem like something he should be getting into.
Right. So, I mean, this kind of came out when Yang was, I would say, less polished than he is now in terms of his campaign. I had noticed that he had sort of tweeted a reply to someone saying he was against circumcision. And I thought, that's kind of a weird thing for a presidential candidate to weigh in on. So I talked to his campaign, and then they said, well, he's against mandatory circumcision. And I was like, well, that's not really an issue in the country, So then they just had him call me up and talk about it, which, again, I mean, talk about an outlandish thing for a campaign to do. Just say, okay, talk to the candidate about circumcision. Mm-hmm. But, I think that's an example of him kind of blundering into something. He's just kind of spouting off his ideas all the time. And for the most part, they're about infrastructure or universal basic income. In this case, he has some thoughts on circumcision that I think did not really work to his benefit.
No, but that thing that you describe, it really is kind of interesting. I mean, that the solution to the candidate having maybe made a gaffe was to have the candidate talk in an unscripted way to you. I mean, I was just over the weekend, I was in New York. I was with a lot of people from the New York Times. And as you probably know, they did this little video series where the candidates all answered kind of, non-traditional questions about themselves. And they talked to all of the candidates except Biden, who wouldn't do it. And I'm convinced that Biden didn't do it because that's not his campaign staff's solution to Biden, to let him talk unscripted about something they've never heard him talk about. So it's kind of interesting that with Yang, they think, all right, well, he's good at explaining himself. Let him talk to Will.
Right, exactly. I mean, again, it's just sort of another example of this untraditional campaign they're running.
Right. So he does need to, I think, maybe clear that up even more, or maybe even in more context. So another thing that he's struggling with right now is I think support he never asked for, but he is kind of popular on the Pepe the Frog meme spewing alt-right, at least among some sectors of that. Can you kind of help us understand how or why that would be happening?
Right. So these are alt-right people, typically white supremacists, who operate on various internet sites. 4chan, which is this kind of very chaotic, anarchic internet forum, would be the main one. So these are the people who, as you say, Pepe the Frog, they were big Trump fans in 2016. Now, some of them are fed up. They think Trump, he didn't get the wall. He didn't do all the stuff they wanted. So they're saying, well, if I'm not going to get that anyway, I might as well support Andrew Yang and get my money, or as they call them, Yang bucks.
So, I mean, obviously there were moments during the 2015-2016 campaign where Donald Trump was asked about support that he was getting from very unsavory elements of the far right, and he often did not satisfactorily respond to that. Has Yang come up with a reasonable response to that kind of support?
Yeah, I mean, his campaign has come out very explicitly many times and said essentially they want nothing to do with these racist groups. So that's certainly to his credit. At the same time, that doesn't seem to have deterred many of them. They are still making Andrew Yang memes and stuff like that. So it's obviously difficult to you can't really blame it on him or anything like that. But he certainly does have this appeal.
Right. I mean, if he gets very far on our show, I've decided we're going to have to do a whole episode about Dungeons and Dragons, because we've never had a president who really played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons growing up, and we know from Yang's bio that he was kind of a lonely kid, a little bit of a bullied kid. So he did. I mean, he really is. He would be the nerdiest president ever, I assume.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't realize he was a Dungeons and Dragons fan. Yeah. That's very interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, he's got a lot of policies. I don't know if there's one or two of them that you'd like to talk about. His policies include everything from empowering MMA fighters to free marriage counseling for all to the American Mall Act to some things that are a little less boutique-y. Are there one or two that jump out at you?
Yeah. So there's one that strikes me that, he may have changed the name on this, but it was essentially an infrastructure program called the Legion of Builders and Destroyers, which sounds like something out of a science fiction novel or something. In practice, it's just
think Aquaman was in both of those.
Yes, exactly. So, it's essentially like almost like a New Deal type infrastructure program. But, I believe the Legion would have a legionary commander or something. Actually, speaking of Dungeons and Dragons, maybe we're seeing some influence there.
Yes. Well, on the other, but is there more to it than just a goofy name? I mean, what is he really getting at?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, essentially just like a really expensive, really wide ranging, infrastructure construction and then destruction of, outdated roads and stuff like that. So, it is the same kind of infrastructure, that the Democrats and Republicans have both been calling for. Andrew Yang puts it in kind of a punchy way that, again, I think shows that he has some talent at sort of making things go viral and making things that'll stick in your head in a way that other policies from other politicians don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, I've used the term game theory a couple of times in this conversation, and that's because I also think, sort of in the sense that, people who do sabermetrics and stuff like that have revolutionized sports. People who are quants, data freaks, have revolutionized sports. Yang strikes me as a guy who started out and he thought, what do I have to do? What's the first thing I have to solve? And that was probably getting enough support numerically to qualify for debates. And he did it. He solved a difficult to solve problem, and he identified that as the problem. And now he's got the first thing that he wanted, which is going to be a very large audience on Thursday night. I guess I'm asking you to speculate. You sort of wonder what he's going to do at that moment with that audience, a chance to talk to a lot of people for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this has been, as you say, this is the goal. I mean, he's sort of like, well, either I can, get on the stage and put out my ideas and then that'll help me rise in the polls, or I'll just kind of spit these ideas out and hopefully they'll get adopted by some of the other candidates.
All right. So Thursday night will be, Wednesday and Thursday night will be very, very interesting. And we thank very much Will Sommer, tech reporter for the Daily Beast. Thanks for doing this, man.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Okay. All right. I called him man. I'm not supposed to do that. I really have made it. There's a certain person on public radio who calls people man. And I have made a vow not to do that. And I just did it by mistake. All right. So you know what? Let's still just edit that. Let's edit it out of the podcast and the rerun. No, we're not going to do that. And you know perfectly well who I'm talking about. Who calls people man all the time? It shouldn't be me. All right, we're going to take a break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk, get in a more serious mood because this is one of the most outrageous criminal cases that I've seen in my lifetime.
I hope you're listening. I really hope you listen. We're sick and tired. Yang is breaking the silence. You're way too pious, accepting what you're providing.
All right. Those of you who listen to the show a lot know that I have a lot of respect for the podcast In the Dark, an investigative podcast from APM Reports, the division of American Public Media. They've done a tremendous job of reporting the case of Curtis Flowers, who has been tried for the same multiple murders 6 times, and who has been the subject of not only prosecutorial overreach, but I would say judicial overreach and maybe other kind and police overreach. And anyway, and I really recommend, I mean, we can kind of update you about this and everything, but I do recommend going back to the beginning of season 2 of In the Dark. If you haven't listened to it already, it's just very well reported. And I don't think there's any way to really understand all this and the magnitude of it and the outrageousness of it without listening to all of this. And I think it's also fair to say that In the Dark played some role and maybe a major role in getting this case to where it wound up, which is the U.S. Supreme Court. A decision came out last week. So rejoining us is Samara Freemark, who's been on before, reporter and senior producer for In the Dark. Thanks for doing this again.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So the oral arguments had already been heard. You guys had done a show that allowed us to hear some of the oral arguments and some of the responses by the Supreme Court. And it did seem, even at the time, and with those interrogatories, it's dangerous to make a bet based on the interrogatories because sometimes judges or justices will ask questions that aren't necessarily exactly what they're thinking. They just want to hear, how the attorneys are going to respond. But setting that reservation aside, it did seem as though some of the more conservative justices who had a real problem with the way that this case had been prosecuted. Alito seemed to have problems, and Kavanaugh seemed to have problems. And in fact, those suspicions were correct. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, that's right. So when we attended oral arguments, it was really striking to see I would call it passion from some of those conservative justices about this case, and just a real sense from them that something had gone wrong. And then we saw that play out in the decision, which came down on Friday. It was a decision in favor of Curtis Flowers, so it vacated his conviction, and it was written by Justice Kavanaugh, who, again, is considered one of the more conservative justices, but in oral arguments spoke very strongly, questioned the state very intensely, and really seemed troubled by this. Alito also joined, as did Justice Roberts and the four liberals. So we saw a 7-2 decision in favor of overturning Curtis Flowers' conviction.
And this hung primarily on the practice of the prosecutor, Doug Evans, of excluding as many black jurors as possible from the actual impaneled jury, with asking often many more questions of prospective black jurors than he did of white jurors. And Kavanaugh said the numbers speak loudly. Over the course of the first 4 trials, there were 36 black prospective jurors against whom the state could have exercised a peremptory strike. The state tried to strike all 36. So, there's a way in which, and I don't know how this resonated with you guys emotionally. You've got a lot sunk into this case. You spent a long time with it. But there was a way in which, even listening to the interrogatories and then reading the Kavanaugh decision, it feels like this was kind of a layup for the court, that, rather than being a case that could speak to a lot of other cases, this case was so bad, so extreme, departed so far from the norms of jurisprudence that for 7 of them anyway, it was a pretty easy one to decide.
Yeah, I think we saw that in the decision. The decision was a narrow one, and Justice Kavanaugh says this in the decision. He says, we're making no new laws. We are just taking the previous standard, which is the Batson standard, and when we apply it to this case, we find that it's been violated. And I think the Supreme Court generally, they are wary of big sweeping decisions. And this was not one of those. But what we do see in this case is that they did really consider the history of all that had happened in the previous trials as well. They weren't just looking at what had happened in Trial 6. They were looking at what happened in all of Curtis Flowers' trials, and they were seeing this pattern over and over again of Doug Evans striking jurors. And so that was, to them, really telling. They said, you have to consider that history when you're looking at what happened in the 6th trial. And if you look at that history, it's clear that this one particular juror in Trial 6 was struck because she was black. And you can know that because you can look at what Doug Evans has done in all of these previous trials.
Right. So you are the In the Dark team made a point of being with the father of Curtis Flowers, Archie Flowers, at the time the decision was handed down. Let's hear a little bit of that from In the Dark.
Hey, what you got going on? Yeah, well, it's probably all over town by now. So how you feeling, man? You said your prayer? You said your prayer there, Bone? Love you too, and I'll see you in the funny paper. Okay.
Thank you for using me.
How do you sound?
You sound good. You sound good, really. So what you heard him talk, he sounded like he was happy. No, he was really. He sure was. I know he was happy because when I go visit him, he didn't have no joy like that. But he happy.
All right, so that's, I should have said at the beginning, that's Archie Flowers talking to his son, Curtis Flowers, on the phone from prison, where Curtis Flowers has been for how many years, Samara Freemark? How long has Curtis Flowers been in?
He's been locked up since 1997, since January of 97, so more than 20 years. And he's been on death row for much of that time.
And for those of you who listen to the podcast, all of these people, I think, become larger characters. So we know Archie Flowers pretty well at this point. On the other hand, although this is a pretty big victory, a 7-2 decision, and we'll come back to the 2 in just a second, all it really could occasion and may occasion, particularly because the prosecutor, Doug Evans, really is kind of a law unto himself in this part of the world, all it may occasion is a seventh trial, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, the Supreme Court can find this constitutional violation, and the remedy for that is that Curtis has the right to a new trial, which, as you said, would be trial number 7. And there's nothing to stop the same prosecutor, Doug Evans, from trying the case again. And I think at this point, over the course of these 6 trials, Doug Evans has been found to have violated Batson by 3 different courts. Mm-hmm. So the trial court has found it, the state Supreme Court has found it, and now the U.S. Supreme Court has found it. And despite that, there's no law that would say that he can't try this case again, which I think is a little bit shocking. It's shocking to me that you could keep getting caught breaking the law essentially over and over again, and yet there is no rule that's going to take you off the case. And so at this point, Curtis is no longer convicted of these crimes, but he remains under indictment. The same indictment that he was put under in 1997. And so he will be moved at some point pretty soon, I think, out of Parchman Prison, off of death row. He'll be moved probably to a county jail where he'll be placed in pretrial detention. And then I imagine that conversations will begin between Curtis's lawyers and the district attorney and perhaps the state attorney general's office as well about what's going to happen next.
You say that you were shocked and surprised that a prosecutor who had been found in the wrong in 2 previous trials and now this one of a very specific kind of violation. Once again, this Batson violation it's the rule based on, I think, Batson versus Kentucky that does not allow prosecutors to consider race in the selection or disqualification of jurors. So 3 strikes and Doug Evans isn't out. You were shocked. It was pretty clear listening to those interrogatories that a number of justices, I thought notably Justice Alito, a pretty conservative guy, but I think with a background in prosecution, that he was shocked that a guy who'd screwed up that badly hadn't been relieved of command somehow.
Absolutely, yeah. We saw that in oral arguments. Justice Alito, a very conservative justice, in criminal justice cases in particular in many situations, but he was incredulous, I would say, at this fact that the county attorney or the district attorney could continue to try this case. I think Alito, I believe, was a federal prosecutor, and this probably wouldn't happen in the federal system because your boss would probably take you off the case at a certain point. But Doug Evans doesn't have a boss. There's no one to take him off the case. And so, yeah, we saw Alito being pretty surprised by this, and I think probably that's part of why he joined in the majority in this. Alito hadn't wanted the court to take this case in the first place. He had opposed the granting of cert. He felt like it wasn't a case that he wanted the Supreme Court to hear. And so I think the case was just so striking to him. The facts of the case were so striking that he ruled in favor of Curtis Flowers, even though he hadn't wanted the court to hear the case in the first place.
Right. Well, I mean, the Supreme Court, they kind of don't often take this kind of case in the sense of they don't often take a case where all they're going to wind up ruling about is this one case. In other words, what they, as you said, this is a narrowly decided case. It speaks very specifically to the condition of Curtis Flowers. The Supreme Court likes to take a case that has a question inside it. And this is the only question really here was, did this one particular person get a fair trial or not? No, he didn't. We should say that there were 2 dissenting votes, Justice Thomas and Justice Gorsuch. I haven't read Thomas's dissenting opinion yet, his minority opinion, but my what I've gathered is that he went big. He not only opposed the reversal in this case or the setting aside of this verdict, he just doesn't like Batson at all.
Right. It was a very fiery dissent. I would say outraged. The tone was outraged. He went into the details of the crime, which was indeed a horrible crime, terrible for the victims and their families. He really railed against the court having taken this case to begin with. He blamed the media, the fact that the case had received a lot of media coverage, for the fact that the court even took the case. And then he went further and actually called into question Batson itself, which is the standing precedent that governs all of these kinds of cases. And he just he's not a fan of Batson. I will say, so Justice Gorsuch joined Justice Thomas, but not in the full dissent. Justice Gorsuch didn't join the part where Thomas was disavowing all of Batson.
I'm going to offer a little bit of speculation. I won't even ask you to react to this, but when I was listening to all of this and reading about all this, one place my thoughts went were, this is such an egregious case. It is such a deep violation of the standards of law. Curtis Flowers is so far away from having received a fair trial, and there's a grotesquerie to some of the things that have happened. I actually think John Roberts looked at Brett Kavanaugh and thought, you know what? You need a layup. You need a case where, first of all, you can join a majority opinion that has all of the left-leaning judges in it, and that also, as Thomas says, has received quite a bit of press coverage. You can write an opinion that most people would agree with, because this is kind of a slam dunk case. So go ahead, you do that one, and you can maybe burnish your tarnished image up a little bit. It just seemed like a good opinion for Kavanaugh to write from his point of view. I do want to just say that one thing that you also did in the dark, and you've been pretty scrupulous about that, is to talk to the people who still feel very wronged by this decision, wronged by Curtis Flowers. So let's hear from your conversation with Mary Catherine Briscoe, a mother of Carmen Rigby, one of the people murdered at the Tardy Furniture location.
No. He's done his part, I think. He's done what he could. And this, I know, is about worn him out, too. But it's terrible, terrible. I just don't want to think about going through it again. I don't know why they just keep on and on with it. I don't understand that. Because we was trying to forget everything and settle down the rest of our lives. So I can't understand why he can't do the same.
At the beginning, she's talking about Doug Evans, the prosecutor, that he's done all he can. You tried to talk to Doug Evans, too, about this. As usual, he was unforthcoming, said he hadn't even read the opinion at that point. You also said that he has no boss. Well, theoretically, the only boss he would have would be the electorate. He wins elections to become the prosecutor. And I assume, based on everything that you've seen, that the Curtis Flowers case, even though it seems like this huge abrasion on the reputation of American jurisprudence, it doesn't play the same way there in Mississippi.
Well, I would say that, so first of all, yes, his boss is the voters. Evans is up for re-election this fall. But he's running unopposed, so he will be the district attorney for the next years. The reaction here, I think, has always and continues to break down along racial lines. Me and another reporter, Parker Yesko, are in Mississippi right now and talking to people about their reaction, and we certainly have felt that. So African-American people in Winona seem very happy about the decision, very pleased, validated, I would say even overjoyed. Most people that we've talked to on the white side of town, it's different. And, Doug Evans, the population of Winona is slightly more than 50% white. And so I think you see that dynamic playing out when you look at the choices that the elected officials, especially the district attorney, are making.
We're going to leave it there, but keep on reporting, Samara Freemark and the rest of In the Dark. We'll keep listening to your podcast, and thanks for joining us today to talk about last week's Supreme Court decision in the Curtis Flowers case. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about those facilities along the border and whether they deserve the name concentration camp. Spoiler, they do. I'm going to say something counterintuitive, at least for those of you who are listening at 1 o'clock, listening live at 1 o'clock. Chion Wolf isn't here today. The reason that's counterintuitive is you just heard her voice if you're listening live. She's not here right now, so she's not here to read the credits, so I will say the credits. This show is produced by Betsy Kaplan, who most often does produce our Monday Scramble. She's our senior producer. Jonathan McPants is sitting where Wolfie usually sits. He's on the board today, and I can't really see in the dark. Is that Jesse who's in there? Jesse, our excellent intern Jesse, is there working phones for us. And I don't know who played the part of Bill Curry. I didn't think that through very carefully. Well, it could be Andrew Yang. Who knows? Tomorrow, we're going to do a show on robocalls. And I don't know too much yet about it. It's being produced by Josh Nalea, which tells me that it is probably going to take a fairly sinister approach to robocalls. Not that there's really kind of a My Little Pony approach that you can take to robocalls, but this could get pretty dark, is what I'm warning you. All right, so here we go with our final segment. And one of the things that was clear in the dialogue of this weekend, whether you're watching Sunday morning news talk shows or just paying attention to social media, is opinion is starting to coalesce around this problem of these detention facilities at the border. And the term concentration camp is starting to be used to describe them. And I think one of the things that drove this, not only the visual details that we're starting to get from those concentration camps or from those detention centers, and believe me, the government is trying to keep those to a minimum, the number of times we see sites from there. But oddly enough, a court exchange. So the Justice Department lawyer Sarah Fabian appeared before 3 Ninth Circuit Court judges, and they were basically questioning her about whether these facilities could ever rise to the level of safe and sanitary facilities. And they themselves described situations where people, including children, are trying to sleep on a bare floor with a metallic blanket for cover, and that's it, and the lights never go off, and how can that possibly be safe and sanitary? And she was kind of doing a humada thing about that. So we want to talk more about this. Obviously, concentration camp is not a term that we want to use lightly. It's not a term that we want to misuse. But David Perry is joining us, freelance journalist, a columnist for Pacific Standard, and a historian working at the University of Minnesota. He wrote a piece this weekend for Pacific Standard on why detention centers on the southern border are concentration camps. Welcome to our conversation, David Perry. Oh, and I should probably actually make sure that David Perry's up on the board. See, this is the kind of thing that happens. David Perry, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, this isn't a term. I think for a lot of people, concentration camp has only one context, and that is the Holocaust. Now, one of the things that you did in researching this piece is even find a book where somebody's written the history of concentration camps, and it is a term that could be used applicably well before the 1930s and 1940s.
That's right. I think there are two things going on. I think there are lots of people. So I want everyone to know I'm Jewish and a historian, and that's really where I come from as I talk about this. I think there are definitely a lot of people who deliberately want to evoke the Holocaust, and that's a good discussion. I think that's not inappropriate, though it's complicated. But what I really want to say beyond that, and lots of people have written about why it's relevant to talk about the Holocaust, and many of them, like me, Jewish, and I think that's really an important conversation, and I'm happy to talk about it. But what I really wanted to do in my piece is to talk about how normal, terribly normal, concentration camps are in global history, particularly in sort of the history of imperialism, but also in U.S. history. So I'm calling you now from the Twin Cities, and every time I go by the airport, as I talk about, I drive by a concentration camp. There's this place, Fort Snelling. It's really a pretty fort. It overlooks where the Minnesota and the Mississippi River comes together. And during the Dakota War in the 1860s, it was used as a prison camp in an extrajudicial way to take families and concentrate them there and try to use that installation as part of a tool to destroy their culture, to get them out of this land, to turn that land over to white settlers. It is clearly part of it. It is clearly a concentration camp, just as it was used in South Africa and Cuba and the Philippines later that century and continuing for decades afterwards. Concentration camps are a normal part of our history.
Now, I think it's fair to ask what makes a concentration camp a concentration camp. Why isn't it a detention center? Why isn't it some kind of other way of segregating a group of people, either pre-trial or pre-deportation?
Well, Andrea Pitzer, who I've talked about and who has been working on this issue for a long time, talks about the detention of civilians without trial based on group identity. And that's sort of the core definition for her that changes sort of from a refugee camp or a prison camp to something she wants to talk about, a concentration camp, where you identify a group, you detain them en masse without trial. I want to push a little past that, kind of with this idea of aiming towards ethnic cleansing, aiming towards removing a people from where they are, isolating them, taking them from where they are and putting them somewhere else, a mission of dehumanization. And that's something that I think is really important in looking at these Trump camps along our southern border, is that since the minute we have had prison installations for people deemed illegal immigrants for a long time, but what we haven't had is in this moment, which since literally the first speech Donald Trump gave announcing his run for president, he has been engaged in the systematic dehumanization of immigrants, particularly from Latin America, and that has only intensified since he's become president. So it's these installations linked to a broader kind of dehumanization message put into practice now with these children who, in fact, are being kept, children and adults, in horrific conditions. So you have horrific conditions, dehumanization, detention based on group identity. All of these things come together to fit very neatly, again, sadly, into the long history of concentration camps.
Right. So, and we talk about these inhuman conditions, and there's a death toll from inhuman conditions.
That's right.
At least 7 children are known to have died in immigration custody since last year, after almost a decade in which no child reportedly died while in the custody of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So we've had, and that can be understood in a number of ways. To you and me, it's a horrific tragedy which departs substantially from the practices that we think of as American practices. If you're going to hold children in detention, you're going to make sure that they're well cared for until some disposition is arrived at. This seems like the opposite of that, and it seems like these deaths are treated almost the way a store owner would treat breakage.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really significant that after days and days of this administration. I just saw this sort of 20 minutes before coming on air with you, so I haven't looked at the whole story. But after days and days, the administration saying they can't do anything, it's all because Congress won't pass funding. In fact, children are being removed from a camp that was deemed unsafe right now, as I understand this morning. Again, I haven't confirmed that, but it's clear that there are things that they can do. There are efforts they can put. I'm very interested in the connections between disability justice and immigration justice, and I've been following over the last couple of years all the stories about children whose medicine is taken away from them, whose access to care is taken away from them, kind of, again, systematically separate them from their belongings, put them somewhere else, and then see what happens down the road. It does seem willful, and again, it seems as an attempt to put into practice this administration's rhetoric of dehumanization. And that ties back into the story of the Holocaust, right? So we've talked about the history of concentration camps in American history, but the story of the Holocaust starts with this kind of dehumanization rhetoric, and then you see movement into concentrating the people being dehumanized, mostly but not exclusively Jews, into these camps, and then we all know where it accelerates. So people who are invoking the Holocaust are trying to say we have to stop this before we continue to accelerate down a terrible road.
Let's hear from one of the people invoking this, as she seems to have done so often recently, driving us linguistically into a more serious consideration of something that deserves serious consideration. Here's Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez.
The United States is running concentration camps on our southern border, and that is exactly what they are. They are concentration camps. I want to talk to the people that are concerned enough with humanity to say that we should not, that never again means something.
Now, one of the ways that there was blowback against that was that she didn't have the right to use that term. She wasn't from an ethnicity that had suffered from concentration camps. You are from an ethnicity that has suffered from concentration camps. How did you process her words?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that neither Meghan McCain nor Liz Cheney speak for American Jews.
Right, yes.
I really just want to say that a lot, and I'm getting very tired of people like them speaking on behalf of the Holocaust. There are a lot of Jews in America. We disagree. We argue. I like to say 2 Jews, 3 opinions. We don't need Liz Cheney jumping in there. But kind of more to the point, I do think we have to be very careful in loosely comparing everything that's bad to the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that that's something we should do thoughtfully. That we also, though, can't say that the Holocaust can only be brought in as a comparison in situations that are exactly like the Holocaust, because that's not hopefully going to happen again. I think that Ocasio-Cortez, she's not Jewish, but she is a Latino woman who was looking at the dehumanization and incarceration, in some cases death, of Latin American immigrants. So, she has one kind of claim on escalating the situation rhetorically, and I have a different kind of claim as an American Jew. And I think that there's room to talk about where we use the Holocaust as a reference point. I do think, again, when you have years of systematic dehumanization followed by the creation of these camps and these terrible conditions, that it is not necessarily inappropriate to say never again is now, that this is the moment in which we can still act before things spiral so far out of control, before so many people die. That's not saying that either of us think it's going to turn into a death camp situation. I don't think it is. But I think it could get a lot worse if we don't act soon.
And I think the other part of that, though, David, is it's already been pretty bad and the government knew about it. So in 2018, the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security went and did a surprise inspection of some of these facilities. He found spoiled food, dilapidated bathrooms with unusable toilets, mold conditions, peeling paint, just a hellhole. That was in 2018, and it does seem as though, I also worth mentioning, these people are held in civil detention. They are not.
Right.
They're not being held in criminal prisons or anything resembling that. That's what civil detention looks like at the border. And I think the reaction to all of that is fine until somebody makes us change it. That's fine if they're sleeping on bare floors and they're cold and they're uncomfortable and they don't have toothbrushes and some of them have the flu. Fine. We're not doing anything about that.
And it does feel like this administration, having sort of made it a year since this conversation first started, the first time there's a big debate around concentration camps and these camps, and we all heard, the voices of children crying and screaming, and then it's been a year from that they are building a machine. They are taking pre-existing material and practices within the Department of Homeland Security and ratcheting them up into a machine to do this again and again and again, trying to dehumanize these people, trying to drive them out of this country, trying to make sure no people don't come through terror and horror and fear. And, if never again isn't now, based on what I just said, then when is it? At what point is it? I am comfortable saying that this is the kind of system, this is the kind of thinking, the kind of government institution, the kind of people like Sarah Fabian willing to defend horrible things because it's just her job. She's just following orders. I think this is the time when we have to say, how far are you willing to let this go? And each person has to stop and think about that. When are they willing to act, if not now?
Right. It does seem as though opinion is coalescing now in a way that may begin to make this less of a partisan issue. Ocasio-Cortez, by getting involved, may have made it intrinsically a little bit of a partisan issue. But I know lots of Republicans. They're not members of Congress, but I know lots of Republicans who are moved by this and who can't stand the idea that we're doing this.
I hope so. One of the things that has been really which has made me glad in the last sort of 4 days, is to see so many American Jews, writers, journalists, historians, some liberal like me. I wear my politics kind of on my sleeve, but not all, really step up and talk about the history here, saying, listen, there's a history in this country and globally of this kind of installation being used in these particular sorts of ways. That does seem to be what's happening now. Those are the facts on the ground. Now, what are we going to do next? And there, I think there's a lot of debate about that. But I do feel like, including from the Jewish community, with a few outliers, we're really, as you say, opinion is coalescing to say this is just wrong.
Right. David Perry, thank you so much for joining us, freelance journalist, columnist for the Pacific Standard, where he wrote about this issue this weekend, a historian working at the University of Minnesota. Special thanks to senior producer Betsy Kaplan for making this all come together. Thanks also to Will Summer and Samara Freemark for being on the show. Get ready for robocalls tomorrow. I think it's going to be more than robocalls somehow. In fact, I'm a little worried about this show. But we'll see you tomorrow.